Great. So, um, this evening we're going to be thinking about love and commitment, um, and friendship, what friendship is, what it can look like. We're going to be looking at the same section of the book of 1 Samuel as we did last month, so chapters 18 to 23. But today we're focusing on David's relationship with Jonathan, the son of the King Saul, rather than on his relationship with Saul himself, which is what we covered last time. Now, Steve, if you can forward on to Stephen's summary, the recap of where we've been and where we're going. So this is session 6, I think, tonight. So we're a fair way through. And we've got a couple more sessions to go. And if you go on to the next slide. So we were introduced to Jonathan back in chapters 13 and 14 before David's ever mentioned at all. And if we look at the number of times David's mentioned in the Bible, it's something like 1,000 times that David gets mentioned. That's more than even Jesus gets mentioned. Jonathan's name appears about 100 times in the whole Bible, but the vast majority of those are in 1 and 2 Samuel and concentrated in a few particular chapters. Steve, when he started this series, if you move on to the next slide, very helpfully he gave us this verse from Romans chapter 15. Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement that they provide, we might have hope. Now, I think since Graham's not had a chance to read through the chapters, we'll do a little bit of reading to start off, and then we're going to dive straight into some discussion questions. So for those of us who were around last month, these are familiar chapters because we worked our way through them last month. But should we read chapter 18 and the beginning of chapter 19? We could share the reading if we're happy to do that. Read a few verses each just to help us get back into this section of 1 Samuel. So, Ian, are you happy to kick us off and read, I don't know, the first half of chapter 18?
Yeah, sure.
And then Steve, if you pick it up and read the second half of chapter 18.
Yeah.
And then Graham, are you happy to read a bit as well?
Yes, okay, which part?
Could you read just the first 3 verses of chapter 19?
Okay.
Or actually you could read up until verse 6 of chapter 19. Okay. That'd be great.
Okay, thanks.
All right. I'm reading from the ESV.
Okay.
Chapter 18. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence, and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people, and David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them.
Remind me which verse that is?
16.
16. So I start at 17.
Yes.
Saul said, sorry, it's the translations confuse me.
Yep.
Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. But David said to Saul, who am I, and what is my family, or my father's clan in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law? So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Then Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become the king's son-in-law. They repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king, so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known.
Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but David was very fond of. So I'll start again. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you. What he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and he saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death.
Great, thank you. So I've got some discussion questions for us. Obviously, we're trying to cover 6 chapters this evening, same as we did last time, which is a lot to cover, but I think it's helpful just reading that first chapter in a bit to give us a feel for what's going on. And we'll do this together. The 3 questions on the slide: what is God doing in these chapters, these 6 chapters? How does God do this? And what does this tell us? So, don't know if you've got any thoughts. Just thinking very big picture. What I mean, chapter 17, the chapter just before we get into this section, is where David takes on Goliath, and then we've read what follows immediately afterwards. So what does God seem to be doing globally in these chapters? Would you say? How would you kind of summarize what God is doing?
Chapter 17 was David and Goliath. Chapter 16, David took the throne, and he didn't take the throne. He was anointed to be king. So yes,
Yeah,
he hasn't taken the throne yet. And so it really feels like these chapters are kind of beginnings of the change of leadership. So Saul is becoming more paranoid, more agitated and angry about
yeah,
David.
yeah,
And so he starts throwing spears and
yeah,
we talked in the last session about that little phrase in chapter 15, was it, that God was going to give the kingdom to a better man?
yeah.
And some point in these chapters, I think Saul really realizes that David's that better man, and he's
And that stirs him up.
indeed.
Talks about him getting very angry. So what is Saul trying to do? What's his aim? What's his stated aim?
He's trying to kill David off, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
But not do it directly.
Yeah. So initially he has this plan that maybe by sending him out into battle against the Philistines, that the Philistines will do the job. But then, beginning of chapter 19, the verses that you read, Graham, he's very explicit. He wants to kill David. He wants David dead, and that continues through these chapters. So that's what Saul is doing. What's David doing? He's killed Goliath. What does he do after that? Just very quickly in these chapters. I know we haven't read them all, but what sense do you get of what David is doing?
Well, he's very much seeking to, well, this is probably not the right way to put it, but to fulfill the role that God has given him,
Yeah,
because he's of course not seizing the throne,
yeah,
and then of course goes on the run
yeah,
while still making sure to walk in God's ways, basically.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's a real sense in which David is trying to. He's aware of the threat from Saul, and he's trying to escape. He's not taking kind of the initiative in terms of taking the kind of power from Saul. He leaves Saul to be king. But David, at times he's on the run. At times he's battling against the Philistines and others. So that's what David's up to. Saul's trying to kill David. David's trying to escape from Saul. But what would you say is God doing in these chapters? How is God at work, given that dynamic of what Saul's trying to do, what David's doing? It's maybe not very explicit, but
When Saul is being tormented by an evil spirit at times,
yeah,
one that presumably God has God has sent.
yeah, yeah.
Don't quite understand quite how that works, but maybe that's not the topic for tonight.
And it seems like God is still dealing with Saul. At one point, Saul is prophesying. So there's still there is some dynamic of God doing things directly with Saul. But given the situation between Saul and David, what is God up to fulfill his stated purpose to make David king?
Well, I want to be careful about saying whether God is causing Saul to go off the rails. I think there's a sort of sovereignty and free will question there.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
regardless of what the technical side looks like, he is at least ordaining that Saul will do all of the things to mercilessly cling on to power.
Yeah.
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 I was thinking about what God's role with, well, how he's using Jonathan in this, and I don't want to say that it's all just purely functional, because obviously I guess Jonathan eventually has to die for David to take the throne. So, but at least part of Jonathan's role is to encourage David actually to keep
Yeah.
going and all of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see that towards the end of this section. Perhaps look at those verses in detail. It struck me that in terms of what's going on with Saul wanting David kind of removed out of the picture because he sees him as a threat and he's jealous, that God is protecting David through these chapters. He's keeping David from being killed, and how is God doing that? Who is God using to protect David?
Hmm.
Well, he's using Jonathan, isn't he? Sort of as almost a sort of spy in Saul's house,
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And those verses that we read from the beginning of chapter 19, very clearly Jonathan coming to, Saul has told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan steps up to defend David. And Jonathan's not the only one who's protecting David. We see other people stepping in to protect David, to help him to escape at points. His wife enables him to escape at one point. David goes and visits some priests, and they also help him. So God is behind the scenes, but God is using people to achieve his purpose, which is to protect David. That's globally what's going on in these chapters. And what does that tell us? This might be a very obvious question, but what do we learn from that God is protecting David, that he's using various people to do that?
God's in charge.
Yeah, God's sovereign. It's not always spelled out exactly what God is doing at every moment, but we see that God is at work, and he's using people to achieve his purposes. And if we think about how we see that worked out in the New Testament, so if you move the slide on, we've got a few verses. So in John chapter 5, Jesus says that his Father is always at work. So God is always at work. He's always doing something. And God uses people. So from Philippians 2, it's God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. And from Ephesians 2 says that we are God's workmanship, his handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works which God prepared in advance for us to do. So this is how God works in the world. God is always at work, and he uses people, he uses us to achieve his purposes. And I think we see that in these chapters of 1 Samuel, in this specific situation of David his life being threatened, God protecting him by using different people. So another very quick discussion question. Move on to the next slide, Steve. So Jonathan is first mentioned in chapters 13 and 14. I appreciate we may not have read those chapters or forgotten what's in those chapters, but before we get to this section, do we have any kind of impression of Jonathan, what he's like, who he is, other than being the son of King Saul? He gets introduced very kind of suddenly in chapter 13, but what impressions do we have of Jonathan from those earlier chapters?
I mean, he's very brave, and he takes the initiative, and he seems to be willing to defy his father. You know, when he eats the honey and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Very good. Any other thoughts?
Doesn't he go on his own, or with his armor bearer? Doesn't he?
He does. Goes off to do battle with the Philistines.
It's a famous victory, but really his courage and what looks a bit like craziness, to be honest.
Yeah.
Is part of what wins the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
He credits God with that, doesn't he? You know,
he does. Yeah,
for that victory.
Yeah. Which I think is very important, because that reveals something about his faith. So he's brave. He takes initiative. He goes off on his own to attack the Philistines. He's trusting God as he does that. So in a lot of ways, I think Jonathan resembles David in terms of character, courage, faith. He's quite like David in those respects. I don't know if anyone's got any other thoughts about that comparison between Jonathan and David. When we first meet Jonathan in this book, it's a few chapters before we're introduced to David, but it almost sets the scene for David, particularly David taking on Goliath. Does that sound reasonable? Thinking about Jonathan and David, the kind of people they were in some senses quite similar.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on, let's go back to the first few verses of chapter 18, which comes after David has defeated Goliath. And can someone just read those verses for us again? 1 Samuel 18, 1-4.
I can read it in this version here.
Thanks.
After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing, and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt.
Great, thank you. So, having had the epic defeat of Goliath in chapter 17, we're suddenly back into hearing about David, about Jonathan, and we're told that that after finishing a conversation with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And that sense of becoming one in spirit jumps out. The fact that Jonathan loves David as himself is mentioned twice in these few verses. And he also makes a covenant with David. And in these 6 chapters, that seems to be a repeated theme as well. The idea of making covenants or taking oaths or swearing friendship with one another comes up quite often. But if we go into the discussion question, Steve, I wonder what thoughts we have about what does it mean to be one in spirit with someone, and how does that happen? How do we become one in spirit with another person? And then also picking up on the fact that Jonathan loves David as himself. Why would we want to love someone as ourselves? What would be the motivation for that? So feel free to jump in with any thoughts in response to any of those questions. Perhaps we'll start with the first question. What does it mean to be one in spirit with someone? Jonathan became one in spirit with David. What could that mean?
First thing that comes to my mind is the idea of being like-minded, wanting the same things.
Yeah.
Sharing kind of goals, motivations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. One purpose, similar heart, similar direction. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, we've seen that Jonathan's very much like Dave, similar to David. So,
yeah,
it's that they've got, like Steve was saying, they've got the same purpose, and they're working together.
Yeah,
and even though, well, Jonathan probably knows that David will be king because he does like give him. Because I think aren't those things he gives him, like the robe, the tunic,
yeah,
sword, bow, and belt? Aren't they these sort of the crown prince's symbols?
yeah, yeah. There might be something in that. It doesn't explain why he does that or what it signifies, but it could be something about, handing over the emblems of kingship or prospective kingship. And Saul had wanted David to take his armor when he went up against Goliath, and that didn't work at all because it was inappropriate. Just the wrong size for David. And maybe there's something about also Jonathan handing over. Handing over his weapons means that he's trusting David as well. He's not anticipating David using that against him. He's leaving himself defenseless in some senses, so there's a vulnerability to it, perhaps. Graham, what you said, you touched on how we become or how we might become one in spirit with another person. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? We're told that Jonathan became one in spirit with David, but how does that come about? What might that involve?
I guess you don't become one in spirit with someone automatically. It takes some effort.
Well, I wondered whether these verses might actually be describing what happens over the following few chapters. So on first reading, it seems like, it seems to be kind of an instantaneous thing. But I wonder if it's announcing what's going to be happening in the subsequent chapters. So, Graham, you mentioned kind of Jonathan and David working together as being part of becoming one in spirit. I think that's true. I think it comes about through working together, and if it is about having the same kind of purpose and unity of heart and mind, then that does tend to come about through having a shared kind of shared goals, shared project or whatever that you might be working on.
It's also possible, Gez, that there's connection before chapter 18.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned, but other things are happening.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of David and Goliath stuff, and
yeah. And Jonathan would have seen David take on Goliath, and this feels like a bit of his response to what David did. And maybe he saw something in David and thought, yeah, David's like me, the same kind of person.
Yeah.
And maybe loving David as himself, which is mentioned twice in these 4 verses. That has something to do with certainly a closeness, an understanding between them. I don't know if this question, why would we want to love someone as ourselves, is helpful. What might be the motivation, or what might be behind loving someone as ourselves? What's involved in doing that, would you say?
Probably depends a little bit on what you think about yourself, because not everyone loves themselves.
True.
My initial reaction to a phrase like that is the person that loves themselves, that they're looking in the mirror every morning, kind of thinking, hey, well, hello there, that kind of stuff. That doesn't sound very positive, though.
No, it sounds quite narcissistic, but
Ian's smiling. He knows what I mean.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, loving someone as we love ourselves, and what's that about? Try to get behind what those words mean. And generally speaking, we kind of look out for our own interests, don't we? And if we're loving someone as ourselves, then maybe it's about looking out for other people's interests in the same way as we look out for our own interests, or the way that we would take care of ourselves. Then, extending that to other people, taking care of other people. As I was thinking about this, there were some other verses that came to mind. If you can move us on, Steve. So again, going back to Philippians, could someone just read those 2 verses from Philippians chapter 2?
Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of mind.
So that talks about being one in spirit, doesn't it? In the sense that we've talked about having a common purpose, having a shared love. And then going on, we've got these well-known verses from Mark chapter 12. Someone else read those for us? This is Jesus answering the question, what's the greatest commandment?
The most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbour as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
Thank you. And the commandment to love our neighbour as ourselves is found in the Old Testament in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, where it says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord." So I found it helpful to think, the idea of being one in spirit and loving others as ourselves is very much a New Testament idea and teaching. That it's not just something that, we see the example with Jonathan and David, but actually it's something that we're encouraged to do. We're encouraged to be one in spirit with others. We're encouraged to love others, love our neighbours as ourselves. That's very much kind of a New Testament teaching. And thinking about Jonathan's relationship with David, that he loved him as himself. He was one in spirit with him. That can seem to be that they had a very special sort of relationship. But in fact, Jonathan wasn't the only one who loved David. If we go to the next slide, Steve.
We go.
There we go. So here's some more references. The first one's one that or the first two are the ones that we've. No, sorry. These are three times in these 6 chapters, this section, where Jonathan talks about loving David as himself. So it is a repeated theme. And then on the next slide, we have the examples of others loving David. So in 1 Samuel 18:16, we're told that all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Verse 20 of chapter 18, we read this earlier, Saul's daughter, Michal, was in love with David. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. And then verse 22, Saul ordered his attendants speak to David privately and say, "Look, the king likes you and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law." And then if we go on to the next slide, Steve. We've got the verses from chapter 18, verses 28 and 29 that again talk about how much Michal loved David. And even Saul, in chapter 16, so earlier than this section that we're looking at this evening, David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. In fact, it's the same word there for Saul loved David. So even Saul, at a moment, loved David. So Jonathan's affection for David, his love for David, is shared with many other people. Let's go on to the beginning of chapter 19, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail now. Actually, given that the time is running fast, let's go to chapter 20. Let's read 1 Samuel 20. I think that'll help us. Stephen, are you able to read some of this for us?
Yeah.
Could you that would be really helpful if you could read chapter 20. So we talked about David being on the run from Saul, and now this will give us an insight into how Jonathan helps protect David. So could you read the first half of the chapter for us, Stephen?
Loading up. 20. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father, that he seeks my life?" So Jonathan said to him, "By no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." Then David took an oath again and said, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved.' But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." So Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you." And David said to Jonathan, "Indeed, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king to eat. But let me go, that I might hide in the field until the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, 'David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family.' If he says thus, 'It is well,' your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that your evil is determined by him. Therefore you shall deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is iniquity in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father?" But Jonathan said, "Far be it from you, for if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you?" Then David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me, or what if your father answers you roughly?" What if your father answers you roughly? And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go into the field." So both of them went out into the field. Then Jonathan said to David, "The Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my father sometime tomorrow, or the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "Let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies." Am I continue?
Just up to the end of verse 17, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Now Jonathan again caused David to vow, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul.
Thanks. So, this is the second time that Jonathan comes to David's defense. The first time seemed to have been very successful back in chapter 19, with Saul taking an oath not to harm David. But it's not too much longer afterwards that he is again wanting to kill David. And David's been on the run. He comes back to meet with Jonathan. And Jonathan can't quite believe that his father is still wanting to kill David. So David sets this up as a test of what Saul's intentions are, and he is absent from this feast where he's expected to be, and the test is how Saul is going to react to that. But what is this telling us about Jonathan and David's relationship, particularly towards the end of the section that Stephen's just read to us? What are our thoughts about what's going on here?
He clearly believes that one day soon, David would be king. And he's asking for David to show kindness to them, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's this kind of covenant making between Jonathan and David. Um,
I think there's a real humility on Jonathan's part. Following what Steve said, he knows David's going to be king. He knows sort of the role, he has been led to believe will be his.
yeah,
It's going to go to David, and he's fine about that. He's willing to take that second place.
yeah, yeah. And it's unusual, really, because given what's happened with Saul and Saul's determination to get rid of David, in some senses, you would have expected Jonathan to have been influenced by his father and have a much more hostile attitude towards David, but not at all. I think you're right that Jonathan understands what God's purpose is in all of this as well. He sees beyond. He sees much more of what God's doing than his father Saul seems to be able to, and he's looking to the future. Um, and he's anticipating a time when David will be ruling over Israel. So, in terms of what happens in the rest of the chapter, Saul's Saul not only wants to kill David, but he turns against Jonathan, and and that makes Jonathan realize that David's life is in danger. Saul even holds a spear to kill Jonathan, and that's obviously a wake up call for him. So Jonathan meets with David again. There's this thing about him firing arrows as an indication of whether David is needing to flee or not. And that brings us to the end of chapter 20. So moving on. Sorry, Steve, if you can advance the slide. So 1 Samuel 20:42 is quite a key verse. Ian, could you read that for us?
Sure. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town.
Thank you. So this verse highlights the relationship between David and Jonathan. If we go on to the next discussion question, Steve, if we just kind of move forward a couple of slides. So trying to relate this very specific situation between Jonathan and David to our own lives and our own situations. What would you say is the key characteristic of the relationship between David and Jonathan?
Seems to be a relationship that surpasses Jonathan's family ties.
Yeah.
So he seems to be putting this first. He's primarily interested in David's interests.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite challenging, really.
It is, and he's willing to go out on a limb for David. He's willing to put his own situation at risk.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what's going on. What is his motivation? What is the reason for him taking such a stand for David?
To add to that, I see in verse 16, Jonathan goes as far as saying, effectively cursing, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies," which I assume he realized would probably include Saul.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which has implications for his whole kind of family line, which is why he's wanting David to promise that he will show kindness to his family in the future and continue to do that. And we'll come back to that later on in this book.
In verse 41, why does David weep the most? I was trying to get my head around that.
He's the more emotional of the two.
It's possible.
I think it's as simple as that. I don't know. We can't read into it too much, I don't think. David is definitely somebody who acts on emotions a lot, whereas I don't
Maybe
necessarily see Jonathan in the same way. And Jonathan seems far more rational minded. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I could be overreading into it. But
It is an interesting detail. It's just, I'd have almost imagined that Jonathan would be so torn, seeing his father kind of ganging up on David again and letting him down in the process, going against the oath that he'd made. I would see Jonathan maybe being more emotional, but I just think it's a fascinating detail.
Yeah, and
Maybe there's no right answer though.
in the same verse, it talks about David bowing down before Jonathan 3 times, which I presume is just a mark of respect, acknowledging Jonathan's position as well.
Hmm.
And is it the fact that David and Jonathan are going to be separated from this point? Although not completely, because in chapter 23, Jonathan comes to David to strengthen him in the Lord. But presumably there's a real sense of loss on David's part. Maybe Jonathan realizes that this is going to end badly for him, but he wants David to fulfill all of God's purposes. So there's the sense of Jonathan accepting the situation, whereas maybe David's not quite there, and the realization of what is going to happen, the loss that he's going to experience, causes him to weep more than Jonathan. In what ways is the relationship between David and Jonathan an example for us?
It's having other people's backs. If they're your friend, you have their six, as the Americans say.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking out for people, caring for them, loving them as we love ourselves.
in a way, Jonathan seems to love David more than he loves himself, because if he loved himself, he would want to potentially be king. So if Saul remained king, he would be next in line. He would inherit the throne.
Yeah.
But he clearly is probably because he trusts in God, and probably because he can see how Saul has kind of gone off the rails a bit. But he desires that David is king above his own right to be king. So you could argue perhaps that, yeah, he loves him more than he loves him, or certainly he wants David's goals to achieve his goals more than he would want to achieve the same goals.
Yeah.
Perhaps he never wanted to be king. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite apt, because what does it mean to firstly to love oneself? I suppose it's about choosing, having your vision for the world, how you want to live life, and I suppose loving other people as much as you love yourself is having their view on how you should live your life and how that benefits. Like, it's a cost benefit analysis, I don't know, in the sense of
Yeah.
he's saying I'm not going to have the best in life because I want you to have the best in life, sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's not anything better than being king, I suppose, even though there's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. 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 It seems to, again, going back to that Philippians 2 passage where it talks about us, not looking out for our own interests, but also for the interests of others, and even putting others' needs before our own is kind of central to loving others to ourselves. But there's something bigger to it. There's the recognition of God's purposes, what God is doing in the world and in particular situations, which means that Jonathan can kind of, in a sense, step back, prefer that David goes on to be the king that God wants him to be, because that's God's bigger purpose. I think there is a lot to do with Jonathan's faith in this, and Jonathan's trust of God. There doesn't seem to be a competitiveness in their relationship at all. And it does seem to be kind of a mutual kind of caring for each other. It's not just Jonathan putting himself out for David. You get the sense that David respects Jonathan, that he's also aware of, in a sense, Jonathan's sacrifice in order for him to become king one day. So we just go on to the next slide, which has a couple of verses on it from this section. So 1 Samuel 18, verse 8 says, Saul was very angry when he heard the people singing about him having slain hundreds, but David thousands. And his question is, what more can he, David, get but the kingdom? So Saul is very kingdom-minded, kingdom-orientated, but it's about him being king and God having made him king. The fact that God has rejected him as king doesn't seem to have sunk in, but he certainly doesn't want David to have the kingdom. And then when Saul's speaking in chapter 20, verse 31, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Talking to Jonathan, now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. So I know Steve was saying last month about maybe Saul suspecting that David was this kind of better man that God had chosen to replace him as king. But I wonder if he held out some hope that that Jonathan would actually be that person, even though God had rejected him as king, that Jonathan would become king in his place. And he sees David as threatening that eventuality.
I think it does say, though, that he's going to give it to one of his neighbours. Doesn't sound like a son.
Have to look at that verse again. Yeah, quite possibly.
We can fight about that later.
How strange that he would give it to a neighbor and not his son.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean that that's not what Saul was thinking, because he might not have had it written down.
Hmm.
I guess the people who would have written it down would have probably been the prophets, and I don't think he was on. Well, I don't think he had met Samuel again.
Oh no, well, Samuel has passed away yet. Not yet. Can't remember when he died. I was just thinking how the situation feels very similar to obviously when Jesus is born and people are talking about him being a new king because the wise men go to Herod and say a new king has been born. And Herod does exactly the same thing of this idea of the threat of a new king needs to expunge it. And it's kind of like, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, the connection there, but it's very similar.
Hmm.
Obviously, Herod goes to quite extreme lengths of just killing all the newborn children, boys of a certain age. But power corrupts, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, let's just wrap things up. So it really, I know often we read these chapters about the relationship between David and Jonathan, and we focus in on their friendship, on the way Jonathan not only defends David and protects David, but helps and supports him. And that's a good thing to think about in terms of what does it mean to be a friend to someone. But I think the bigger picture here is God at work, and God using people to achieve his purposes, because that's what God continues to do today in our lives and the world around us. God is at work in the world. God, there are things that only God can do, and things that only God can bring about, and we would call those miracles, those things. But he wants us to be part of what he's doing, and he will use us to achieve his purposes. So the fact that God's always at work in the world, that God uses people to achieve his purposes, changes how we see our own kind of lives and what we are doing. Because in one sense, Jonathan being friends with David, and all of that, all of what that meant, could look like a fairly, ordinary, everyday sort of thing. But God is using it to achieve his ultimate goals. And I think that's true of what goes on in our own lives. And as we relate to others, and as we help and support others, or as we receive help and support as well, that is how God is at work in the world, and that's how God is fulfilling his purposes. And Steve, you just go on to the very last slide, the verse from Hebrews 11. Sorry. So I think at the heart of all this is the faith that we see exhibited through Jonathan and David's relationship. And this verse from Hebrews 11 tells us that without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And I think that this is where it has impact for us, because our faith leads us to do things, to treat people in a certain way, to act in certain ways, to pray certain things for people, to be there, to support others, and through us and through others, God is achieving his purposes. But without that faith, and I think without Jonathan's faith, it would all look very different. So I hope that's been helpful. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, and these chapters are well worth digging into further. But we'll wrap up there, and it would be good just to pray before we finish, if that's okay, Steve.
Yep, go for it.
Lord, thank you that, these chapters that we've looked at reveal what you were doing in David's life and in Jonathan's life, Lord, and how you brought them to a situation where they were one in spirit, Lord, and they shared a common purpose, a common desire, Lord, to see your kingdom established, Lord. And thank you that story continues for us today, Lord. Your kingdom is a reality, Lord. We're part of your kingdom, and you are building your kingdom, Lord, and using us in small ways and in large ways, Lord. So pray that you would just help us, Lord, to think through what you're doing, Lord, how you've helped us through others in the past, how you've used us to help those around us as well. Lord, please, speak to our hearts about what we can do in faith to contribute to your kingdom being built. Lord, help us to be like David and Jonathan, Lord, to love others as ourselves, Lord, to see the bigger picture, Lord, to trust you for what you're doing. Lord, help us not just to be going through the motions in everyday life, but Lord, to see what we can do to serve you and to serve others for your glory, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.